Okay. All right, and we are recording, so we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. This is the 5th session of the Bad Buildings webinar series. My name is Kelsey Romer. I am an AmeriCorps member with the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, and I do my service with the Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center at WVU. So today we are going to be talking with Patrick Kirby, who is the former director of the Brownfields Assistance Center, one of the founders of it and Bad Buildings. So definitely a great person to be here on the series with us today. He's going to talk to us about demolition because he is now the Chief Operating Officer at Raze International, Inc., which is a company that works on demolition. So before we toss it over to Patrick, I'll just give you the spiel of the the technical stuff today, as always. We're going to use the chat for questions, and we're going to take your questions as we go through the webinar today, because we're going to make this kind of a Q&A style event. So if you see anything that you have a question on, go ahead and drop it in the chat. Let us know. We'll get to it as we're going through each slide. And then if you have any technical issues, I'll drop my email in the chat. You can reach out to me or add that in the chat as well. Don't hesitate to reach out or speak up. There's no silly questions. We're here to help you learn all you can about the demolition process, because it's definitely a confusing one. So there's going to be some more announcements about the rest of the webinar series at the very end. So stick around and stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Patrick, and we'll get started.
Hey everybody, it's good to see faces again and be back with the Bad Buildings program. I really appreciated the invitation, and I'm excited to talk about demolition before the demolition actually happened. So I've been with Raze International for about a little over 3 months now. It feels longer and shorter all at the same time, and a lot of exciting things that I've learned in the process that I'd like to share with you. So I'm sharing my screen, I believe. All right. So as folks that know me know that I like to name things, and when I was asked to be a part of this webinar series, we needed to know exactly what I was going to talk about, which is never normally a problem for me. And it came up with 1, 2, 3, boom, except it should be obviously 3, 2, 1, boom, except what I wanted everyone to realize is there's a lot of things you still need to know before a building comes down. And we're called on a regular basis for quotes and for information and to figure out how to get things down to the ground, or when stuff can be saved, and all the different components of that. And I know the Brownfields Assistance Center and the Bad Buildings program does a lot of work on that front, but and I'm hoping to bring a couple more nuances and things that you may or may not have thought of, and some best practices as you work through what you're trying to do with redevelopment in your community. So Raze International is an industrial, commercial, and residential demolition company, but we also perform environmental services and site development work. But enough about me, you guys know me. How do you prepare for the boom? First thing I've learned is that insurance companies do not like the boom. So that is a good point to know, that there is not as much booming in this booming business as I anticipated there would be. And there aren't as many wrecking balls because insurance agents don't like them. But that being said, as you prep for your boom, because it is a big impact in your community, what do you need to ask yourself? And that actually comes before you figure out how much it's going to cost to do what you want to do. And then we're going to end with some things to consider even after you've gotten to the point where you know the cost, maybe you've hired somebody, and how will this demolition work impact your department, your city, your community, the neighborhood. So as we start the countdown, and we all agree that it's going to go boom on 3 and not on 1. You see how it's important on the communication front? And sometimes that's actually missed. So let's start with what is being torn down, why is it being torn down, who is actually going to pay for that demolition. And this comes up more than you know, because it seems like you're talking to a city and it would be maybe the city's going to tear it down, but really the city's pushing an owner to tear it down. And how does that all work? When do you need it torn down by? Let's talk timelines. And what do you want the site to look like after the demolition? I know that's a little forward thinking, but I always used to, I still say this actually, you can't achieve a goal unless you set it. So if you don't know what you want it to look like after the demolition, it's hard to actually score that win. So if you start with what's being torn down, this seems like the easiest part of the question. I want that building that I drive by every day that's been blighted for years. But I don't know if you guys realize, but West Virginia had an address program for GIS for mapping, a mapping program, and everyone got to name their own streets if the cities weren't already going to name them. So a lot of the old rural routes suddenly became, Kirby Way or whatever, whoever lived there might have wanted it to be. So having the right address, having a photo confirmation of the property, as well as the yellow house, not the blue house next to it, that matters. And again, the ownership, because it gets mixed up quite a bit. And just even in 3 months, I've gotten a lot of calls that say, I want this torn down. Can you give me a price? And it's, well, I mean, is it yours to tear down? I mean, before we sort of invest time to do that. The bonus round questions are, what do you want to be torn down? Obviously the building, but getting into the specifics about the footers, foundations, chances are if it was a house or even a large building, there's probably going to be some landscaping around it, maybe some retaining walls that need to stay. And that matters because it impacts the time that that my crew is going to be there, and it impacts cost and other things and access, as well as the garage or other outbuildings. There are some times where you're going to save the garage, or the assumption is that it actually be easy to access from where the garage is. So do you want that to come down or not? And having that as part of the request is pretty important. So I threw this in here because I think it's important to know the answer to this question. It's, why is it being torn down? And I'll explain the asterisk here in a second, but I mean, is it fire damage like the image below? Is it beyond repair? Is it going to fall in? Is it going to fall into another property? Is it just abandoned, dilapidated, and it's on your list and you're ready to go? Is there a connection to the unwanted activity that's then contributing to number 3? It's abandoned, dilapidatedness, and its connection to it being either on fire or beyond repair. Many people remember me saying, if I watched the news and I would come into the office the next day and say, oh, something caught on fire. I mean, surprise, it's been abandoned for 5 years or less. That's always the concern. And it's not just that abandoned building catching on fire, as many folks joke about, because that's an easy way to deal with it. It's all the adjacent properties. The picture here actually is adjacent to another property that's not in great shape, but there are people that still live there, and it's impacting because it caught on fire and almost caught their house on fire, and now is just sitting there with rats and other things. So the reason I put the asterisk there is I do care about preserving things. I do care the reason why it's coming down, but mainly from my new perspective, it's to make sure that the crew is safe, that what kind of equipment I'm going to need to get up there to do whatever I'm going to need to do. I mean, can they go on the second floor? If it's not structurally sound, and I don't mean from a structural engineer standpoint, I mean from a sheer safety, common sense. If we have this information, we can make judgments on what we have based on our own internal safety protocols. So I've got by the why. The other part of the why, and I'm not going to, I was talking to Kelsey about this earlier, but if you don't know the why, they might not ask us, or the contractor may not ask the client, but other people are going to ask. The neighbors or another constituent or the news will ask, why are you tearing this one down? Or the property owner, if you're not the property owner and you're trying to get it torn down, they may want to know. So you should have a ready answer to that. But then for us, it's also, who's the client? Who's called me or or Tom Brown or one of the other companies and said, hey, we want information on tearing these down, or, you should be interested in bidding on this stuff. Okay, so what are the bidding requirements going to be? Because the funding and who the client is, if it's a city versus a development authority that may have other rules for procurement, the terms and conditions, is it, even though West Virginia doesn't have prevailing wage, some federal grants do still have that. So that's going to impact cost of, and what we're going to be paying the crew, but all that needs to be considered. And also, we just had a situation where there's a private property owner that owns a lot of blighted properties, slumlord, and a municipality is going after them. I'm very much interested in taking care of those properties, but it's nice for me to know that is going to be the payment required is going to be different than if it was just the city and we were under contract with the city to do it. And it may then impact how quickly we're able to respond on the quote front, which we'll talk about later. But that's what we're trying to get all figured out for sure, is who we're actually working for. And then when do you need it demolished? This is going to impact a lot of things, but there's a 10-day notification requirement specifically related to abatement in West Virginia, asbestos abatement. But the rules are that you actually have to have a 10-day notification for any demolition. Is the practical implication of that, because you have to prove or have the report that it does or doesn't have asbestos. So if you, even if it doesn't have asbestos in it, you're still submitting that report to prove that it doesn't, and that's part of a 10-day notification. And so lots of times we get a hurry up and wait, or hey, if we sign this, we want to do it tomorrow, and we would love to do it tomorrow, or most likely soon. But there are other requirements that you have to consider. The other thing is, in construction, you talk about the summer construction season and some different impacts there, but in terms of how busy everybody is. In demolition, I mean, it's again all seasons, but there are certain clients that come to bear to do different kinds of work in different seasons. So a lot of school systems are doing asbestos abatement work in the summertime or on the breaks in the winter. And those timelines really matter, because it's going to impact how many people may bid on projects that you're putting out for bid, or their availability. And sometimes our clients have put ourselves in a position, or potential clients, where they're backed into a corner for when they need to get something else done, and they maybe waited too long to bid it or something. And you say, great, so here's our start. Here's when you have to start, and here's when you have to end. I'm not saying it's bad to have a plan. What I'm saying is, when you do that very specifically, you're probably going to increase your cost, because you're probably backed into a corner, and we're then backed into a corner from a certain number. Even though it can say a certain number of days, that's different than just saying like, here's 5 weeks worth of work and you need to do it in 3. And also on your timing, if, with your notice to proceed, there's lots of paperwork that says, you will start this day. But going back to that 10-day notification, if you only give me 60 calendar days to do it, but I don't work, it's not that we don't work weekends, but we typically try to keep the guys on a regular work week schedule like everything else. You say 60 calendar days, and then I just lost 10 days because of the notification. So now I'm at 50 calendar days, which is not necessarily 50 working days, although we would make it work however we needed to. But I'm just trying to keep you guys on your toes and thinking about things that we're seeing on this side of the fence. The other thing is, what are your expectations? Obviously we want the site cleaned up at the end, and all that's written in, and we understand what that is. And I want you to have stringent expectations for how the site is left. But talking about grading or even seeding and mulching, is there something in there? Is there some sort of warranty where not only do you want it seeded and mulched, but you want the grass to grow first? And depending on which time of year it is, would change that, because I wouldn't necessarily tear down the building in February and say we're going to have grass, growing. But at the same time, um, what is the expectation? Because it can get pretty confusing. I mean, or just, hey, we thought we were good with this, we did XYZ, and now this didn't grow. Are we coming back to hydro seeded, or maybe you don't want grass at all? And that matters too, because that impacts cost on our end, so that impacts price on your end. So thinking through that. And the other thing is, when we talked about footers and foundations before, are you going to rebuild on the site? Trying to understand that. And if you don't know the answer to that, trying to understand, can you put clean hard fill in, in a basement area for compaction later and use, or not? And honestly, we don't have a preference, but when it's unclear, it can complicate things, or assumptions are made, and trying to get the end product of what you're looking for at the end. Just take the time to have that conversation with your contractor. So we're getting closer. We've gone from 1 to 2, and I really want to push the lever all the way down. And everybody's going to say, well, how much does it cost to get that lever all the way down? Well, the it depends caveat answer that everybody will tell you is based on a combination of these 4 things. How big is it? Now, as my mom recently told me, she always, because I'm the youngest, would say biggest isn't best. I got that, I'm covered. But it was, the biggest isn't going to be the most expensive, but how big is it? What's inside of it? And then what is it made of? So is it a large wooden structure that's going to have to go as construction and demolition debris? Is it a large concrete structure that's going to be really hard to get through? Or is it steel and there's going to be some cutting and some other things? I mean, so those things impact how long it's going to take. And again, getting it to the ground does not mean the project is finished. I mean, so how long it takes to get to the ground versus how long, so that goes to how can it be accessed? How can we get trucks in there or containers to load out the construction and demolition debris? And how challenging that could be. In this picture that I have up, and I'm actually going to move you guys over here if that's okay. Can you still see yourselves on my screen? So this is a steep hill. This is in the beautiful city of Wheeling, and I don't say that sarcastically. I love the city of Wheeling, but they're addressing some blight on a particular street. The other side of the street is actually all coming down. But on this one, the reason I took this picture is you see these power lines? I never looked at power lines. I look at power lines now. I mean, you're just driving around and you think, oh, how hard can that house be to get to? But then it's how do we, it's not easy to just get power lines. I mean, you don't get them moved and turning them off. I mean, it's pretty complex. So how do you then build a spot? And if this yellow house, you can't see me pointing at my screen, but if this yellow house is coming down, where do you actually put a container when the road itself and the trucks have to still make it through? And then how are you going to load that out? And then for the houses on the other side, they're literally over a hill. And how do you get down there to them to get that debris out? And that definitely impacts cost. And then the other is, and this is from my brownfields days, I know, but the asbestos. I mean, it's a requirement. Has the abatement been done? If it hasn't been done, it goes back to how much it's going to cost and whether or not the inspection's been done ahead of time. And then it impacts timelines. So we just have to be able to answer that question. Other things I want you guys to consider that you may not have thought of is how far is it to this C&D landfill? And I talked with Kelsey when we first started planning for this, and it was terminology. So C&D, construction and demolition debris. There's specific kind of landfills you can take it to. The cost per ton and how far it is going to impact the cost for the project. Clean hard fill is things like brick and CMU block that can be used as clean hard fill material. I mean, people actually use it. Many cities used to actually stockpile it for different needs that they would have. And is there one that's close? I mean, is there a reuse? And I don't mean just to dump the clean hard fill, but is this whole world of aggregates, it's a thing. So you don't have to be an expert in that, but it's going to impact the cost. And then if there is asbestos abatement, how far is the asbestos landfill and the timing of it? I mean, when you're sending the truck to the landfill, if it closes at 3, you know, how many trips can you make as a contractor to get what you need to in that day? The other issue is in all demolition, there should be water to keep the dust down and to keep things wet. That's something that you may not have thought of, but you have to get the water from somewhere. Are you getting it from a fire hydrant? Are you getting it from a neighbor? How is that being billed? I mean, we don't mind paying for it. That's not it. It's just we also don't want it to have to come from really, really far away. And we have water trucks and things like that, but it's a lot easier if we could talk to somebody close by and have an access point for that. But then you have to think of too, is it going to cross a road? And does the contractor then have stuff to protect that hose across the road? I know, guys, I never thought of half of this stuff, but it's all part of the consideration when you're getting these costs. And then the local rules, ordinances, or permits. So your contractor should know what permits they have to get. They should be calling 811. They should be doing all of this stuff. But there are ordinances in certain places that actually might make a lot of sense, like a reconsideration if someone wants to tear down a historic structure. We're actually supportive of that. What's complicated is if we go to get a permit and then we're told that we can't actually tear it down, even though we were hired by a private party who hasn't been to city council to go through that process. So that goes, you see, if these things all tie together, if we know who our client is, we can make sure that they've checked with city council, because we already know that has to happen in that particular locality for that to happen. But there's stuff that comes up because the one in the city Wheeling actually just recently changed, and so just trying to keep up with that, or other permits you want. I mean, for the municipal or the county folks, I mean, what extra things do you want as part of the conversation to make sure that they've been completed? What communication with the different departments, or if you're a private or an economic development authority, what information do you want your contractor to have shared with the utilities and other stakeholders? And then the other consideration for impact of cost is scrap and metal. And I have advised many folks, I mean, in terms of looking at it, normally is in the language of a bid or in a contract is who's going to retain the salvage. And I say scrap versus just salvage because I talked to Carrie and Kelsey about the fact that the salvage and the deconstruction piece is an amazing conversation and a lot different things happening. And I'd love to be part of that conversation, but it's a whole webinar in itself. But the scrap metal does have a value. You probably don't know the different values, and it's very complex in terms of the value is determined on how you can get that commodity into, I mean, different people pay different amounts for it, but I bring it up here to just say, ask your contractor, just say, can we get a credit? Or if it's going to go, how is that impacted or played into the price? And so, and normally on houses, it really isn't. I mean, there just isn't enough to make the tonnage that you need. But if you are dealing with an industrial building right now in this market and have some other environmental issues, but you could start on the demolition now, I would actually look at it and say, well, this would be a good time in the scrap market to be looking at industrial demolition. And so now I want to talk to go through, so an estimate versus a quote versus a bid. An estimate is how much you think it's going to cost. Some of the things I just went through. And so you would call somebody like me, or I could give you a ton of other resources across the state of West Virginia to say, okay, what do you think it's going to be? But you have to ask yourself that, I mean, or I'm going to ask you, are you just costing it? Are you ready to do the work? Because it impacts whether or not I drive to you 3.5 hours tomorrow, which I'm happy to come look at anything, as most contractors I'm confident are. But if I've got a list of other things to do, just understanding what that timeline in really goes a long way to a good relationship with demolition contractors. Because if we get excited about something and we rush down to see it, I mean, lots of times, and we understand this in the process, that that work may not be happening for 3, 6, 9 months, 5 years. I'm prepared for that from my brownfields experience. Although you all know that I'm on the optimistic side and know that it won't happen if we don't take a look at it and put a price on it. So, because I know that you can't raise a question mark from a grant perspective. So that goes to the second part of it, is what's the funding source and is there a bidding requirement? So the difference between then an estimate, which is like a ballpark, so you could maybe put it in a grant. So a brownfield grant, you just wonder, how much ballpark do you think this would take? And there are so many variables, but if you're looking to say, I mean, is this 20,000, 200,000, that's a big jump. But what does this look like? That's a legitimate question, but the estimate is most likely not going to be a written estimate. It just doesn't, because then what happens is you get held to that, or if you want it to be a written estimate, then have that conversation. But then the quote is more specific, where you could actually accept a quote, like a quote is good for a certain number of days. And we've sharpened the pencil and said, we're quoting this, so if you said go, we'd have to go with this price. Now, the reason I threw then bids, and how could that possibly be different, because if folks at a city call and say, hey, what would this cost? What's the difference between a quote and a bid? Well, the bid is the final numbers that I don't want to bid against myself, nor does any other private entity. So I can't go and spend, the time that I would spend, put down a bid price, not knowing who else is possibly going to bid, and then have that work go out to bid as it should, and it's competitive. And then I'm basically bidding against myself because that number has been used by everybody. The other thing to remember for all three of these things is the market, in terms of going back to the metals market, like the scrap market, the labor market, the cost of gas, all impact the cost. That's why they're the timelines on sort of how much it's going to cost and when, because normally when you ask for a quote, I'm looking ahead at the calendar and saying, okay, great. So if they said yes, I could take this on. And so I'm blocking out time to potentially do this work. And so that's why you have those timelines in place. and bids are more specific too. And they just provide a lot more specs that you can really say, okay, great, this is exactly what I think it's going to cost me. And this is exactly what I could do it for. I know that seems very similar to a quote, but the reason I'm differentiating is because most of the time bids are low bid and so you're competing against this sort of invisible market. And because you don't know who is actually going to bid, how many people are going to bid, and how is that going to work. And it could change. I mean, in terms of saying, as you guys all know, I like to go after all projects because I like them all to work. And obviously I have people in my life that pull me back and say, you can't do everything at one time. So if we bid, it's a formal thing and you're like, you're going to do this. A quote typically isn't like a specific finite date, because you're then waiting on the client to get back to you. And that normally doesn't just happen the next day. They go back and review it and look over things. And so, are there any questions on this particular part of it? Because I feel like I took something simple and made it very complicated.
We had one just come in, so that was perfect timing. Steven's asking, have you seen anyone that hired a contractor on a year-long contract? And if so, how did they bid? Square footage, or how Did they
So
change?
if so, I mean, the state just had a bid out for a master service agreement, and the challenge on that is it normally would be on unit prices, and but if that's in a specific area, because the challenge on the statewide contract is you don't have any sense of really what's going to come in to then, I mean, in terms of what your unit price is to do the work, but you don't know all of the other extraneous over, like you don't know what the travel cost is going to be, then gas, and then if you're doing larger work on abatement, you don't know what it's going to be for mobilization. But if it's in one community, you can typically get a better price on more than one for the demo side for more than one house, or more than one building, just because of it actually. I used to think mobilization was just an added cost. I mean, and I'm just being candid with you guys. I was like, oh, right, well, couldn't we get rid of that mobilization cost? Well, it actually cost somebody to tow this 300, this machine, which all have numbers, a lot of fun, learned all about that now too. But these different large pieces of equipment from point A to point B, independent of, the cost of your drivers and everything else, but the permitting and the time that it takes. So by having a place to actually keep some of that equipment, if you were on like a year-long contract to stage it, you could potentially save some money. So he said, I'm sorry, unit cost versus what was the other piece?
Square footage.
Yeah, so the square footage really just calculates out to the C&D, the construction demolition debris, like amount of loads, which then actually turns into tons, or depending on the landfill, potentially yards if stuff was really heavy. But it's really, and then there's a cost per load is where, and there's no way for the contractor. I mean, if they have their own C&D landfill, yes, they can get it, they can do it cheap. Then they would be going and paying the landfill fees, but they've still then permitted and have their own landfill and have to get it there.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any other questions in the chat just yet, so I think we're good.
Okay.
You can go to the example.
So the example that I wanted you guys to give, and I saw someone from Fairmont, not before I used the example, but we had talked to Shay. I wanted to show sort of the details when I talked earlier about the demolition being completed within a certain amount of time. That's a positive thing. I mean, in terms of saying, here's your window, as long as the number of buildings can be completed in that amount of time. And then it also, at the bottom here, talks about the steps to be removed in the old basketball hoop. Right. I mean, how specific do we have to be? Except, like I was thinking, how specific would you need to be in the actual bidding document? But the fact that the steps, because we are in West Virginia and, things are not all just flat. We're not just going in, taking the house. And there are other things to consider, but the basketball hoop or the retaining wall. And if certain things stay, that could impact access. And also, how are you getting the machine up to some of these places? So thinking about the sidewalks that are out in front of these houses or whatever, making sure that you stay on your contractor, maybe take pictures of the sidewalk beforehand. I mean, are they putting down dirt? Are they putting something down tight? I mean, so the weight of the machine itself doesn't then destroy something else in the process. Especially with some of the infrastructure in some of the cities and towns that I've worked in, it seems easy that you would just roll the piece of equipment over there and then have the machine do it. But trying to pay attention to what's around it ahead of time matters a lot. And then number 5, I talked about they include the salvage considered and included in the quoted price, and specify some other things that impact our insurance, which is helpful. So how do you get a quote? I just circled back on this from remembering all the what to see. So the address with photos, super helpful. Knowing if there's been an inspection. If there isn't, it's okay. Just know the answer to that, because that is part of the timeline and cost. And then how quick you want a response. That's not going to impact price, but I mean, if you know that answer, then you can find out if you can get a response. If you just call a contractor and say, hey, get me a price, and you don't ask for it by a certain amount of time, they're up and down the river, across the state, doing all sorts of stuff. So trying to get that information back to get the quote out to know where you're in the queue is important. And then dealing with the ownership to know whether or not, are we talking to the owner? Are we talking to a neighbor? Are we talking to the city? Is the owner calling because they got a note from code enforcement, so they just need a quote so they can take it back to court and they don't plan on actually doing it? What's helpful for us to know about that is we'll remember who the owner is. And when they call the next time, I mean, we may not just drop everything, give them a quote so they can take it back to court, but we could also talk to the city and say, hey, they're not actually planning on doing anything. You know, they did take our quote, but that was, you know, old, and they're just trying to do it so they don't have to do any work. And then that's where the purpose of the quote comes in. I mean, just be as honest as you can, or give as much information as you can. You know, we're trying to do this because we're about to apply for an EPA cleanup grant, and it's going to be 18 months until we actually do anything on this project, but we could really use a number. Great. So since you're already preparing for it in May of 2021, that's amazing. So I have a month or so to get out there and really take a look at the site, and then I could definitely get you a price prior to when you complete your analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives and share your draft with the Brownfield Center by early August. That is amazing. You know, you're really on top of it. So if I know that level for the purpose of quote, I can work that into the day and get you better information. And then too, where to send it. That seems easy, but lots of times we just get a number, you know, leave an email, because we're going to be sending a document, hopefully on a quote. So if you want something written back, I can't send that to a phone number. So share as much information as you can. Other fun stuff to consider that I didn't consider. And it's not 3 things to consider, it's 3, because we're almost done. And I am setting a record pace for myself personally, and I'm very excited by that, so that I'll have time for questions at the end. So what do you do with the stuff in the building? So the machines, if you leave it in there, it doesn't all just get like taken out. I mean, it can be tossed as waste, but if, depending on how the contract is worded or priced, if there's a bunch of stuff in there that's going to have to go as waste, then there's a charge for that, because that's additional waste that's going in. Or if someone's going to come in and they say they're going to take everything, anticipate that at least 20% will still be left. I mean, that's just the way it happens. But make sure you get in there early. The schools that we have been working on and tearing down as they build new schools, they'll do auctions, and that's great, but everybody then wants to go back and they'll call us and say, hey, can we come back in the building and look around? Once we have gotten that contract, we essentially, under most contracts, I'd say 90%, we're taking ownership of that property for that time frame. We're responsible for it. So I would love for you to take a tour down memory lane, but my liability insurance doesn't like that same tour. So there have been many folks that I've worked with over the years that have been very creative about how they do that, and having events ahead of time before the demo, before the building is completely messed up, or having somebody go in and take some stuff out. I mean, we'll work with everybody locally. But if we have to keep coming out to meet somebody, I mean, sort of Facebook Marketplace style, it really impacts, going back to that timeline, our costs and liabilities. So just try to think that through on the front end. Second one's exciting, and I think we've all probably seen this happen, but we never thought it was going to happen, and then it happened. And we are there, we are tearing stuff down. And do you want me to talk to the news for you? Is there a special county commissioner that should be there to talk to them? What is the message? Because often the news does not come when those people are there at the site. So you can get ahead of it and send out information and then plan those moments and that messaging, but really plan ahead and maybe even tell the contractor, we don't want you to talk to anybody on site. And I'm not offended by that. And I can then share that with the crew to say, if somebody comes on site, this is who you refer them to. We actually have that in place, generally speaking, but it's something that is often not thought of. And then next thing you know, you see somebody on the news who knows very little about prior history of the building, what it's going to become in that site. And in the meantime, all you get is the sound clip is, we're just tearing it down. And that doesn't, that doesn't help your cause. So, and the third one is demolition is noisy and it impacts traffic when you're moving large machines up onto different sites. So we consider that in our scheduling of different things, but you potentially have flaggers and other things that the city folks that are on this, I mean, you have to consider that, because you could lose time by getting stuck in traffic the wrong day, or everybody else can lose time because you're stuck in the middle of the road on the wrong day. And then the neighbors are a huge asset. And is somebody sending notifications to the neighbors? You want the contractor to send the notifications to the neighbors? Is there potential that the neighbors' houses, something could happen? I mean, worst case scenario, and are those neighbors' houses being protected? Do they have pets? You know, how are they being informed? Because they can be obviously a big help, but it's impacted, and they could be happy that it's coming down, but that doesn't mean that the process of bringing it down isn't going to interrupt some things in their life. And then the utilities. So you guys are probably pretty aware that a lot of utilities are buried underground. And while we typically, as part of a demo, are on top, we're worried about the power lines. We're also worried about water lines and other things that are supposed to be shut off. And we go through as much as we can to make sure all of that happens. But I will just tell you, you know, we've had the phone calls because, I mean, first we internally get the phone calls from the guys. Hey, it looks pretty. There's a, you know, new sprinkler over here. Well, why is there a new sprinkler? Well, we contacted the water district and they said, oh man, we didn't know where those lines were. We do now. That is, I'll tell you, that's actually going to really help. And because we've been looking for those, which throws you off, you know, you're like, I can't believe you didn't know where they were. But then if they say, you're probably going to hit more, I mean, so there are two things that are happening. They're impacting the whole area around them. So the water district is happy that they found their water lines, but Carrie is calling me pretty mad because she's having a cold shower and she doesn't know when the water is going to come back on, and or if there's a business that's shut down. And so obviously that looks bad on us. So we don't want that to happen. We get those calls very seldomly, but I'm aware of stuff like that happening. And same, obviously, you know, being careful and making sure the gas lines and things are shut off. But I was actually talking to not a demolition person, but a construction person over last weekend, and talking to the landowners. I mean, obviously, they might know more than even some of the public folks, that because they've been living there or may have added a line somewhere. And it's tough to get that information until you're actually starting to dig and, oh, you know, that pipe may go back there to that other house. So as much information as you can get to make it run as smoothly as possible, just keep that in mind. And then these two things go back to this sort of, I go to the metals and the scrap, but I remember walking through an old brownfield site with a former city manager, and you guys probably also saw recently, you know, catalytic converters were being stolen off the bottom of cars based on their value. What happens is that people go into buildings and they can get really hurt by trying to steal copper and other, I mean, if the power's not off, I mean, stuff happens. But also, if you know, I mean, even if it's owned by a nonprofit, if you think it's headed in a certain direction, securing it is going to be better, both from a safety standpoint and from later from a value to you, because if everybody's gone in and just ripped everything out, that value goes back to what I said earlier about a potential credit on the project. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, it's not necessarily huge, but it's money that's being taken out of that structure that you're eventually now dealing with if you're on this webinar. And So saying, hey, we really need to communicate with the police department and everybody else and say these buildings have to be secure, not just for the scrap, but so the fires don't start, but the cost versus impact of securing the buildings is really the value has to be in doing as much as you can to secure it as soon as possible. So now that it's been secured, you know what to ask for a quote, you've gotten a quote, we are ready to go. We have gone under contract, we've talked to the neighbors, we've made friends, we let the news know that Ray Moeller was responsible for getting this money in place to solve this significant issue. And if it wasn't for him and Nicole, then this project could have never happened. And all we do is roll in with the machines and hopefully turn the microphones over to you guys. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better insight into some things to consider as you're spending, going into 21 and trying to deal with your blighted structures or even your redevelopment projects where, you know, you just need that extra space because maybe something's functionally just obsolete. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys. I get pretty passionate about any of the work that I do. Obviously, I love the brownfields, and now I'm pretty excited about getting in large machinery.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. Man, who knew demolition was so complicated? You need a PhD for a wrecking ball. This is crazy. So I mentioned in the chat a few times, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in. You can see also that Patrick has his contact information there on the screen, so jot that down if you want to reach out to him later. But for now, we've got time for Q&A, so leave your questions in the chat and we want to get to all of them. I want to go ahead and start. We touched on this a little bit back when we were talking about the funding, but your anticipated reuse plan, is that something that you have to have a fully kind of drawn out plan in place before you ask for funding? Is that going to help you get funding, or do you have to have all of that worked out in advance, or can you kind of leave that for later? How does that factor in?
So the key is there are two different components to that question. One is if you're getting funding for to get money for the demo prior to ever talking to a contractor, yes. I mean, you don't have to have a fully flushed out plan, but you have to know that most funders don't want to just invest in the demolition of a site. And the demolition of the site is just part of the overall plan. But when it comes then to talking to the contractor and saying, they're going to ask those questions I was talking about related to, can we backfill this, or and it's typical standard stuff. I mean, stuff that seems like, oh, well, they just want to dump this hard fill back in this, you know, in the basement. Well, it just depends what you're going to do with the site. It may save you a lot of money, and it may be the exact perfect, you know, industry standard for what's supposed to happen when an old building is torn down, depending on what that final use is. But if you think that there's going to be construction that comes in later that would impact that, you know, that then you say, hey, great, well, this is the time we have, so we do have to pull everything out, and that changes what you're asking for. So having some sense of that is super important. We and I've seen it in projects. I mean, there was the demolition of 2 schools down in Mercer County that's going to go great, but I know that it was impacted both by, I mean, from a schedule standpoint, by asbestos and sort of, I mean, I think they have longer term plans, but trying to understand what to do with the sites afterwards impact how the contractors would talk to them or the price they would give them to do the work.
Right. I know it gets tricky because that's always something I hear a lot with the brownfields work is, you know, you don't always have a full plan worked out. You know, you have this site that could go one of 3 different ways, and you don't always know at the very beginning which one of those 3 options are going to pan out. So I can see how that complicates things sometimes, but having a better sense of that plan definitely is going to help you in the beginning, sounds like. I don't have any other questions in the chat so far. So I think we might be good to start wrapping up. I've still got almost 10 minutes here. So any other closing notes, any other things you want to emphasize, any other parting words?
I guess what I would say to everyone is that the process to getting to the cost, I see a big opportunity that for on redevelopment projects, more contractors should be consulted for their expertise and how to get something down. I think that engineers obviously know what they're doing. They're doing amazing reuse plans, but when it comes down to it, sometimes you just need to figure out on some of these more complex things, what does it look like it's going to take? I mean, does it, because it's about the access, it's other things that just aren't being considered. It's not just a structure coming down, it's all the logistics that go along with it. So I would just, I don't want to just encourage you to reach out to me because I think there are many other people that have expertise in this, but just to say, okay, great, we're considering this project and this is why, and just be upfront on the purpose. This is kind of a longer term thing, but we think that, you know, what do you think about this? And look back at all the amazing EPA grantees that just will be receiving funding starting October, but just got awarded or that already have funding as you look at that redevelopment planning, Kelsey, that you were talking about, and don't select yourself out from, even though we're talking demo and that's excluded per se, but as helping pay or be involved with planning the beginning steps of that process.
And I learned just when we were, you know, prepping for this webinar that all of those, like that example of the Fairmont bids, that's all totally public. Like I just Googled that and found it. That's all out there. So if anyone is listening and wants to kind of, you know, get some other examples of those bids, you can Google those because they're all public information. So if you want to get your eyes on a few more examples, you can pursue that too. So yeah, I think we're good to go ahead.
Kelsey?
Yeah. Oh, hello, Ray.
Hey, since I got named in this presentation, I thought I'd ask Patrick, is it okay if I quote you, attribute the quote to you of, we're just tearing it down? Is that, because I officially heard you say that earlier in this presentation.
So what I am learning, Ray, is I have to know my role professionally and personally, and by knowing my role is if it is our job and it is our scope to do XYZ, that's what we need to be focused on. But I anticipate that I'm going to be asking those why questions back to my client anyway, so, and maybe help them develop the why.
Well answered, my friend. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Excellent. All right, well, we've got just a couple of minutes left. So thank you so much, Patrick, for that. That was great. I know it's going to help clarify a lot of this for a lot of people. So definitely appreciate you being here today. I mentioned in the beginning that I wanted to go ahead and announce the next few sessions. We have the rest of the summer's webinar sessions firmed up now. So we've got coming up next month, one called Bad Grads, which is going to be a discussion with some of these bad communities. Some members from them, we've got Rick Healy from Moundsville and Shay Strait from Fairmont. So we're going to be able to show you all from their perspective, you know, from these communities that have gone through the bad buildings process. You'll be able to hear from them a little bit of what it was like to navigate it. Then the next month in July, we've got How Can You Love Your Block, which is going to be with some of my fellow AmeriCorps members, Kaylin and Katie, that are the Love Your Block Huntington coordinators. So you're going to hear about that program, which is another sort of similar to Bad Buildings program, community-driven group. So it's about change in your community from that ground up kind of perspective. And then in August, we're going to have a special Tuesday session that is on August 17th. That is going to be in conjunction with the West Virginia Brownfields Conference. That's going to be with Patty Hickman from the Land Stewardship Corporation on the role of land banks in redevelopment. So all of those are on the Bad Buildings website. You can register for them now, and we would love to see you at each of them throughout the summer. So thank you all very much. Oh, I see. Yes, thank you, Carrie, reminding me. We've got an EPA grant writing training, which will be a deep dive into doing your US EPA brownfields grants. So that is going to be a 3-part series, also throughout the summer, and you can register for that on our registration page. I'll include all these links in the follow-up email with the recording of this webinar that I send out afterwards. So go ahead and keep your eyes peeled for that. So thank you all again. We will see you next month and have a wonderful day. Bye, everybody.